I arrived in town last night at about 10 o'clock from a meeting in Baltimore, a gathering of commissions and committees of the Episcopal Church. There are about 200 of us gathered at a conference center charged with continuing to work on the church's business post-General Convention, which was last summer. I was appointed to what's called the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music, which we call SCLM. And we received a lot of specific pieces of work to do in the time between general conventions. But one of the pieces of work that we received is a pretty big deal. It's planning a process for the revision of the Book of Common Prayer. It's not revising the Book of Common Prayer. If you're looking online, we're not going to revise the Book of Common Prayer right now. Jessica's taping. We're designing a process. There are 20 members of us on the SCLM, and we represent a beautiful cross-section of the Episcopal Church. The youngest member, by the way, is 22 years old, which is awesome. The process of revising any book of worship is a big deal. It just is. Because it has the potential to have consequences in the life of the church for decades to come. I mean, it's a very big deal. And naturally, there is some fear associated with this piece of work. Some people fear that the revision of the prayer book will go too far. Some fear it won't go far enough. And as you all know, people just generally fear change. But fear is really not the worst thing in the world. Even when it feels like it is the worst thing in the world. What is worse than fear is pretending that fear isn't in the room. Pretending that fear isn't in the room makes people a little bit crazy. So if we ignore fear, we may sometimes get angry, or we may get sullen, or we may hunker down and get quiet. If we pretend that fear isn't in the room, we may do maybe the worst possible thing, which is striving to be perfectionists. Because perfectionists believe if they just do everything perfectly, then nobody will get angry with them. And they won't have anything to be afraid of, which is, I don't know if you've noticed, impossible. But if fear is driving us, it becomes increasingly difficult to pay attention to the kinds of values that you could hear about lived in the life of Jesus. Values like compassion, values like love, values like making peace, values like welcoming the unprepared. And if we get really frightened by something, if we get really shut down by our fear, we may just forget living into truth, which is what I hear in this gospel passage. Pilate, one of the two actors in the scene, is playing the inquisitor to Jesus. And Jesus says this peculiar thing. Jesus says that his way is in truth. In fact, he's bet his whole life on living in the truth of God's message of love and forgiveness. He's bet his whole life on calling everyone into common life in God, whether they're prepared or unprepared, good or bad, or anything else. And he gathers his authority from this assurance. He is solid in himself. He stands solidly in his truth. He does not back down. And I think that Pilate is just afraid. You may, if you've ever heard this read before, or read it before yourself, you may have recognized that this passage ends before we get to the famous line of Pilate, where he asks the question, what is truth? And I recognize that kind of theoretical question when I get really super scared. Let's not talk about what's going on here. What do you mean? Let's define our terms. It's a dodge, I think. I think it's a dodge. And I don't think that Jesus is being super snarky with him, which is, I mean, it's easy to hear Jesus' voice super snarky in the passage, right? But what I think Jesus is doing is loving Pilate and telling really hard truth to Pilate. And the problem is that if Pilate really wanted an answer to the questions, all he would have to do is to look at Jesus and find the answer. But there's so much fear in the room that he goes into this, frankly, pretty silly interrogation about authority. Pilate asks Jesus if he is a king, which is the sort of droll question you might ask in any bad piece of political theater, because Jesus is obviously a prisoner of the empire. And he doesn't look much like a king. He's standing in the house of horrors called the Praetorium, which is known to have been a location for both physical and sexual abuse of prisoners. He's on his way to a Roman cross. If he's a king, then Pilate is trying to say something to the whole crowd about their notion of kingship. What Jesus looks like to Pilate is like a pile of human filth. So the question about whether or not he's a king is a question designed to further humiliate Jesus, and in fact to further humiliate whoever happens to be in earshot of the interrogation. It's bad comedy. Bad, dark comedy. And Jesus refuses to play along. He refuses to be the punchline of Pilate's sick joke. Jesus says, in a fairly straightforward and calm way, that his authority comes from a place that Pilate just cannot see. Jesus is so far outside the role of the humiliated political prisoner. He is so full of his own authority that Pilate is blinded to truth. Fear is eating Pilate from the inside. And Jesus' response is this: do you ask this of your own accord, or have others said it to you about me? Snap. But he's not finished yet. Jesus has to school Pilate on what real authority looks like. He says, mine is not a kingdom of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my men would have fought to prevent my being surrendered to the authorities. As it is, my kingdom does not belong here. Which tells me that Pilate is looking in the wrong place. But finally, Jesus tells Pilate the truth about his vocation, and also about Pilate's own participation in what you might now call God's unfolding story. Jesus says, it is you who say that I am a king. I was born for this. I came into the world for this, to bear witness to the truth. And all who are on the side of truth listen to my voice. So Jesus just lays it all out for this representative of the empire. Pilate wants to know what Jesus has done. He wants him to confess his crime before his execution. But the real issue is not what Jesus has done. The real issue is about his origin. Where does he get the authority on which he's acting? And the answer is so off-putting and so odd to us that we try to spiritualize it. Because he says, it is not from this world. The actual quote is, "My kingdom is not from this world," which doesn't mean that Jesus is talking about some kind of airy, disincarnate spirituality. He's not divorcing who he is from the materiality that we all are. It simply means that his kingdom doesn't operate the way that Pilate's world operates. Pilate's kingdom operates on the basis of oppression and exclusion and violence. Pilate's kingdom is about fighting, about who's strongest, about winning by domination. And Jesus' kingdom, the world that Jesus has come to create and is still, frankly, I hope, creating in the world today, is about living in truth. It's not about ignoring fear. It's about admitting that we can be afraid and we can still stand in truth. The kingdom that Jesus brings to birth is about peace and about forgiveness. It's about living in truth, living in the world in a different kind of way, which means dealing with anger and fear in a completely different way. You or I know me, I may go to sullenness or to anger when I'm afraid. But Jesus stands in his truth. His kingdom, his way to peace is not from this world. His kingdom comes from the God who is only found in love. One of our dancing saints, Thomas Aquinas, heavy-set fellow, right to that side of Jesus, second from the wall. Thomas Aquinas said this: "Fear is such a powerful emotion for humans that when we allow it to take us over, it drives compassion right out of our hearts." Does that sound familiar if you've read the paper recently? I think that's what we're seeing in our nation in the aftermath of the most recent round of terrorist attacks in Paris and in other places. Terrorism frightens the hell out of me. Frightens all of us, I think. And sometimes that fear makes us irrational. So our elected officials, both local and national, both Democratic and Republican, have decided to make compassion illegal. We cannot take in Syrian refugees, they want to tell us. We just can't. We have to live in fear. Even though, according to what I read this week, says there's only a 1 in 12.5 million chance that you will die in a terrorist attack. You actually stand a better chance of being elected president, which is 1 in 10 million, than being killed in a terrorist attack. Even though that truth is there, you need to live in fear. That's the message the empire has for us today. And as a result, as Brother Thomas said, compassion is driven from our hearts. So at the meeting in Baltimore last week, I was chosen, which continues to boggle my imagination because I know myself well, I was chosen by the SCLM to be the chaplain for the group. I know. Right? Well, which means I'm in charge of getting other people to plan worship for meetings, which is awesome. But it also means that on my phone there's a Google alert that's going to come up every Friday at noon, which is to intentionally pray for each member of the commission. I said it for 52 weeks. I will receive a reminder every Friday at noon to pray specifically for 20 members of the SCLM, because as a group we need prayer. And I'm pretty certain that all the members of the SCLM are going to pray for each other. Because frankly, there's a lot of fear in this work. There's a lot of fear about our responsibility and what might happen, and it seems like a big, big deal. And fear can drive us crazy and make us forget dealing in compassion with each other and living together in truth. And I think we can say the same thing about us here today, now. Praying for one another is like a safety net to keep us from going crazy in fear. I mean, I am trying to follow Jesus in this crazy dance that he's leading us in. And in that dance, I cannot imagine that prayer is just an airy spiritual thing. It's got to be rooted and grounded in the messiness of life. It has to admit that fear is in the room. Prayer has to look straight on at the other person and see his or her life as imperfect. Prayer has to live into vulnerability. Prayer has to take risks. The truth is that each person for whom I pray and for whom you pray is worthy of love, belonging, connection, and honor, even when you're scared to death. I mean, all of which is to say, I think that if I'm learning anything about following in the way of Jesus, it is that it is a way that does not bypass fear. It's a way that admits fear, but doesn't stop there. It's a way that doesn't need to be perfect, just alive and striving. It's a way that welcomes me to stand in the truth of God's love and to deal with myself and with you compassionately. That's what I'm learning about Jesus, whose authority is not from the world of scarcity and fear, but whose authority is from the God who is love. And that's what I'm learning about walking in his way today.